The weight of the gun. The man in the doorway had been dying for about 20 minutes. We could hear him, not screaming, past screaming. A low sound, rhythmic, like someone trying to remember the words to a song they had known their entire life and could no longer find. The sound a man makes when his body is still working on the problem, even though the problem has already been solved. His name was Conrad. I kept the MG-34 trained on the gap between what used to be the ground floor window frame and the pile of collapsed masonry beneath it. 12 centimeters of open space, the width of a man's hand, enough for the barrel, enough for the light from the fire 2 blocks north to come through in a thin orange bar across the floor. That fire had been burning since midnight and showed no sign of stopping. Whatever was feeding it had been feeding it for hours, and the light it threw was unsteady, moving across the rubble in a way that made everything seem alive when nothing was. Felix was to my right, his back against the wall, knees pulled up. I could see him in my peripheral vision working his jaw, grinding the back teeth the way he did when he was keeping still by effort rather than by nature. Felix was from Cologne. He had the energy of someone who had grown up in a city that was not being reduced to chalk. And sometimes in moments like this one, that history showed on his face as a kind of bewildered fury that had nowhere to go. We had been a crew for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in this city was a long time. Long enough that I had stopped measuring time in days and had started measuring it in buildings. And we were on our 14th building, or our 15th. I had lost count somewhere around the 8th. In Stalingrad, the buildings blurred. What you remembered were the specific geometries of survival. The width of a window gap, the angle of a staircase, the distance from one pile of rubble to the next. You remembered the useful things. The rest receded. Conrad made the sound again. Felix looked at me. I looked at the window gap. The street between us and that doorway was 40 meters of open ground under that orange light. 40 meters of geometry. The Soviets across the street had already demonstrated twice tonight that they understood geometry as well as we did. Private Huber had tried to go out at 2 in the morning. He had not made it 4 meters. Huber was not Conrad. Huber was somewhere in the rubble to our left. He has passed the collapsed section of wall, and he was no longer making any sound at all. There was nothing to say about the 40 meters, so neither of us said anything. Brenner came back from the rear of the building in a low crouch, moving the way he always moved. Not fast, not slow, but with the particular economy of a man who had learned long ago that unnecessary movement was a form of spending money you did not have. He had been at the runner's position, trying to get word back to the company. The lines had been cut since the previous evening. The runner had not returned. He settled in beside me and looked at the window gap for a moment. Then he looked at the doorway. Conrad had gone quieter. Brenner said something about the attack. First light. Full company push. Artillery and air support first. He said it the way he said most things. Flatly, without weight, as a statement of what would happen next rather than what he hoped would happen. Brenner was 34 years old and had come through Deadliest the previous winter, which was a thing that marked men in ways that did not always show on the surface but showed in the way they spoke. Everything he said sounded like he had already accounted for the ways it could go wrong. I told him I had heard about the attack. He told me again anyway. This was how information moved in Stalingrad. Not through official channels. Those were cut, had been cut, seemed always to be cut. It moved through repetition, through men telling each other the same thing until the telling became a kind of ritual. A way of acknowledging that you both existed in the same situation and had processed the same facts and arrived at the same place. The attack had been talked about for days. Every ruined house, every blown-out stairwell, every cellar full of men staring at nothing. All of it had been vibrating with the knowledge that something large was coming. Something that would end this one way or another. I had stopped thinking about it. Thinking about tomorrow in this city was a habit that burned through you faster than it gave back. Better to think about the window gap, the 12 centimeters, the rough edge of the brick on the left side, the way the orange light moved across the dust still settling in the street outside, settling from whatever had collapsed in the early evening and never quite finishing. It just sifting down in slow curtains whenever the ground shook, which was always. Conrad had gone quiet now. Brenner checked him once, moving low along the wall to the entrance, and pressing himself into the shadow. He came back without expression. He settled into position and looked at the window gap and said nothing. That was answer enough. I had known Conrad for 11 days. In the life I had lived before this city, 11 days was not enough time to know anyone. You learned a name, a general impression, the outline of a person. But in Stalingrad, 11 days was substantial. In Stalingrad, you measured relationships the way you measured everything else, in what had happened during them, not in how long they had lasted. 4 days ago, Conrad had pulled me out of a building on the next street over. Yet a wall had come down during a mortar barrage, not on me directly, but close enough that the concussion had put me on the floor and the debris had covered the exit. Conrad had come back for me. He had not been ordered to. There was no tactical reason. He had simply come back the way certain men do, without announcing it as a choice. I remembered his hands, the specific grip of them when he pulled me upright, the way he had not spoken, just pulled and moved, because in this city speech during movement was a form of noise, and noise was a form of dying. I had followed him out, and we had not discussed it afterward, because in this city you did not discuss the things that mattered. You registered them. You filed them in a part of yourself that did not have a name, and you kept moving. 3 days after he pulled me out, Conrad had said something to me that I had not fully processed at the time. We had been in a cellar, waiting out a barrage, and he had said it quietly without preamble, looking at the wall rather than at me. If it comes to it, don't come out. I had not responded. He had not asked me to respond. We had both understood that this was not a request for reassurance. It was not pessimism. It was something else. A practical arrangement between men who had looked at the arithmetic of this city long enough to understand what the numbers meant. He was not asking me not to care. He was asking me to care in a way that did not get me killed over 40 meters of open ground under orange light. He was asking me to survive him, and now I was doing it. This is what American men who came back from Korea understood without being told. The men who held at the Chosin Reservoir in November of 1950, 30,000 of them surrounded in temperatures of 30 below. They understood the particular mathematics of that kind of agreement. You do not leave your man, except when leaving him is the only way to honor what he asked of you before things went wrong. The veterans who came home from those wars, from the Chosin, from the Ia Drang Valley, from the Hurtgen Forest, they carried versions of this same arithmetic. The knowledge that survival is not a betrayal, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for a man is to stay in position. Conrad had understood this. I stayed in position. Felix shifted against the wall. The grinding of his jaw had slowed, which meant he was moving from active suppression of feeling into the quieter territory of exhaustion. He was 21 years old and had been a printer's apprentice in Cologne before the war. A man accustomed to making things that could be read, that had clear meaning, that communicated exactly what they were intended to communicate. He had told me about this once, briefly, in the way that men in this city talked about their previous lives. Carefully, with a certain distance, as if describing someone else. The world of the print shop was a world of precision and legibility. Every letter in its place, every line justified, every page a statement of controlled intention. Stalingrad was the opposite of a print shop. I sometimes thought about this when I watched Felix manage himself through long, waiting periods like this one. The effort visible in the set of his shoulders. The way he would occasionally look at something, a piece of rubble, the pattern of cracks in the wall, with a concentration that was not tactical, not survival-oriented, but simply the concentration of a man trying to find some order in what he was looking at, some legibility. He rarely found it, but he kept looking. Earlier in the evening, during the long period between the last Soviet probe and Brenner's return from the runner position, Felix had asked me something. He had asked it quietly, almost to himself, but directed at me. Do you think the men across the street are waiting the same way we are? I had not answered. Not because the question was naive. It was not naive. Felix was not a naive man. He asked it because he was the kind of person who needed to understand the human reality of what he was inside, or even when, especially when, that understanding gave him no tactical advantage and no comfort. He asked it because not asking it was a form of reduction he was unwilling to accept. I had thought about it after he asked. In the silence of the position, with the orange light moving across the gap and Conrad making the sounds he made, I had thought about whether the men in the building across the street were sitting in a mirror image of us. Whether there was someone across that 40 meters with his back against a wall and his knees pulled up, watching a gap in the masonry, listening to the fire and the distant percussion of artillery that never fully stopped. I did not know, but the question had stayed with me. That was the thing about Felix. His questions stayed. The fire 2 blocks north shifted color sometime around 3 in the morning, orange to a deeper red, almost maroon at the base where it caught the brickwork. The shadows it threw across the street grew longer, the intervals between them darker. I adjusted my position against the MG-34, resettling my shoulder, finding the natural line of the weapon. The gun was cold. Everything was cold. October in this city came in without announcement and stayed without apology. The temperature had dropped again in the last hour, and the ground beneath us was transmitting that cold upward through the floor debris, through my coat, into the bones of my hips and knees. Soldiers in the cellars had started talking about the winter, the way you talk about a thing that is coming and cannot be stopped. The previous winter in this part of Russia had killed men not with bullets but with temperature, with the specific violence of cold that moves into the body and begins shutting it down floor by floor, the way a building is cleared. I did not think about the winter. I thought about the window gap. My left ear had been ringing since the day before, a high, persistent tone that sat behind everything like a signal from somewhere too distant to interpret. It had started after a close barrage and had not stopped. Through it, I could hear Brenner moving periodically in the rear of the building, making his slow checks of the position, and I could hear somewhere deep in the structure behind us the sound of water dripping from something into something else, a slow, patient sound, indifferent to everything happening around it. And I had been listening to it for 2 hours and had not been able to identify the source. At some point, I had stopped trying and let it become part of the background, part of the constant low register of this city at night, the drip, the distant artillery, the structural settling of buildings that had absorbed more than they were designed to absorb, the sounds that might be rats or might be other things, and that it was better not to investigate. Brenner crouched beside me again around 4 in the morning. He was quiet for a moment, looking through the gap at the street. The fire had burned lower. The shadows were different now, longer, more definite. Then he said something that he did not intend as an explanation. He said, "We will take the factory or we will not." He said this the way he said everything, without inflection, it as a mathematical statement. The factory was the barricade, the massive weapons complex that had been producing artillery pieces for the Soviet army until the bombardment had made production impossible, and then had become a fortified position, and then had become the objective, and then had become the reason we were lying on the floor of a destroyed building in the middle of the night listening to a man die across the street. The barricade was 300 meters to the north. In any other context, 300 meters was a short walk. A man could cover it in 4 minutes at a comfortable pace. In Stalingrad in October 1942, 300 meters was an abstraction, a mathematical statement about a distance that had no relationship to time or effort. I had done the arithmetic. On one of the way you do arithmetic in the dark when you have nothing else to do with your mind. From our current position to the factory perimeter, approximately 400 meters. At the rate the 6th Army had been advancing through the workers' district, measured not in kilometers but in buildings, in floors, in the specific rooms that had to be taken and held before the next room could be approached, 400 meters represented roughly 11 days and somewhere in the range of 2,000 casualties. Since September 13th, when the main assault on Stalingrad began, the German 6th Army had been losing an average of 3,000 men per day. Not in dramatic open-field engagements, in rooms, in stairwells, in the 12-centimeter gap between a window frame and a pile of rubble. And the Soviets lost more, far more, but the Soviets had more to lose, and they had chosen this city and this method of fighting deliberately, understanding that the geometry of urban combat erased German advantages in armor and air support and replaced them with something the German army had not fully prepared for: the brutal arithmetic of equal suffering at close range. 400 meters, 11 days, 2,000 men. This was not pessimism. This was the same kind of accounting that Brenner used when he assessed positions. You looked at the numbers. You noted what they meant. You did not let them change what you did next, because what you did next was determined by the orders in the position and the weapon in your hands, not by the arithmetic of the larger situation. But you knew the numbers. Knowing the numbers was a form of honesty. And in this city, honesty was the most useful thing you could carry, because it weighed nothing and it did not run out of ammunition. Brenner checked Conrad one more time before the artillery started. He came back, and his face was the same as it had been. Set. Functional. The face of a man who has learned to hold difficult things without letting them alter his utility. He settled into position on the far side of the room, where he had a sight line on the interior doorway and the rubble-filled area between us and the entrance. He did not look at me. This was, I had come to understand, a form of consideration. Brenner understood that there were things you could not help men with, that the architecture of certain griefs was personal and could not be entered by another person. He only acknowledged from the outside. His way of acknowledging was to not look, to give you the privacy of your own processing, to trust that you would arrive at the same functional state he occupied, and that the mechanism of arriving was your own business. I had served under officers who believed that talking through difficult situations was a form of leadership. They were not wrong, exactly, but they were working from a different manual than Brenner. Brenner's manual had been written by the Demian's pocket, by the winter of 1941 to 1942, by the specific education of being surrounded and running out of everything, and discovering what remained when everything ran out. What remained was the basics. Watch the gap. Check the weapon. Keep the man next to you alive if you can. Do not spend what you cannot afford. Conrad had made it clear what he could afford. He had done this in advance, deliberately, as a gift. I understood that now in a way I had not fully understood when he said it. The artillery started before the sky was fully light. Not ours, theirs first. 3 rounds spaced, landing somewhere to the northeast. Then nothing. Then 2 more. Then a longer pause that had a different quality than the pauses before it. Denser, more expectant, as if the city itself was inhaling. Then the German batteries opened, not one at a time, all at once. The whole weight of the division's artillery committing in a single coordinated moment, the way a door slams rather than closes, the kind of sound that stopped being individual explosions and became a continuous physical pressure, something that pushed against your chest from the inside, something that reorganized the air in your lungs and made breathing a deliberate act rather than an automatic one. Felix pressed himself flat against the wall. Brenner was already at the entrance, watching the street, which was either extremely professional or extremely foolish, and I had stopped being able to tell the difference. I kept my hands on the MG-34. Not because I was brave. Bravery had nothing to do with it. I kept my hands on the weapon because the weapon was the only fixed point in a world that had lost its fixed points. And because holding something that had weight and purpose and a clear function was the only form of stability available in a situation that had no other kind. The gun was cold. The metal was certain. These were the things I had. The Stukas came over before the sky had finished lightning. You heard them before you understood what you were hearing. A distant mechanical note, high and thin, that grew without pause until it filled the entire sky, and then kept growing past the point where the sky seemed large enough to contain it. Then the dive. That sound was different. Lower. A tearing, descending shriek that the men had developed specific names for. None of them suitable for polite company, all of them accurate. The first bomb landed somewhere north of us, close enough that the floor moved under my knees, not jumped, moved, a long, rolling displacement, like the ground was considering its options. The second was closer. The third I did not hear as a separate event. By then it was continuous. The mind did a thing I had noticed before during heavy bombardment. It narrowed, pulled back from the edges, abandoned the wider questions entirely, and concentrated itself down to a very small point of attention. The gap in the wall, the weight of the weapon, the sound of my own breathing, which I could feel more than hear. Everything else, the dying, the arithmetic, the questions Felix asked that did not go away. Conrad's hands, the agreement we had made, the 11 days that were a form of knowing, all of it receded into a kind of white distance. Not gone, present, but moved back. Stored. Later I would be told the bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours. At the time it had no duration I could measure. It existed as a single continuous state, the way fever exists, the way being underwater exists, a condition you are inside of rather than a thing you are experiencing. When the Stukas pulled away and the artillery slackened, the silence that followed was not silence. It was the ringing in both ears now, not just the left. And beneath the ringing, the continued percussion of impacts further away, the city continuing its work at a distance. And beneath that, new sounds. Men shouting in German somewhere behind us. The mechanical groan of something tracked moving on rubble. Orders being passed through the building in clipped fragments, arriving stripped of half their words. Brenner turned from the entrance. He held up 2 fingers, pointed toward the street, made a short forward gesture with his hand. 2 minutes. Then we moved. I got the MG-34 up onto my shoulder, 12 kilograms of weapon plus the weight of the drum, and Felix was behind me with the spare barrel and the ammunition. And we went out through the entrance into what the bombardment had made of the world. The street was unrecognizable, not because it had been destroyed. It had already been destroyed days ago, weeks ago, layers of destruction stacked on top of each other until the original street existed only as a concept, as a memory of a function this ground had once served. It was unrecognizable because the bombardment had rearranged the destruction, craters that had not been there before. A wall that had been standing when I last looked, gone. The building across the street, the one the Soviet fire had been coming from all night, had lost its upper 2 floors entirely. The masonry brought down in enormous collapsed sections that had spread across the street and added new obstacles to the existing ones. Winged gray dust hung over everything in a low cloud that tasted of brick and something chemical I did not try to identify. We moved north along the building face, staying close to the wall. 20 meters ahead, the lead infantry section was already crossing the street at a run. I watched them go. Some made it to the other side. Some did not. The ones who did not fell in ways that were different from how men fall when they trip or stumble. A quality of sudden weight, of absence, a change in the relationship between a man and gravity that, once you had seen it, you never confused with anything else. Felix was at my shoulder. I could feel him there even through the noise. The way you know without looking where the people you have worked alongside long enough are positioned. He said something, and I caught the word ready and nodded without turning around. We crossed at the point Brenner had indicated, a gap between 2 collapsed sections of the opposite building that would give us partial cover on the approach. Brenner went first, then me, then Felix. The crossing was perhaps 15 meters and took no measurable time at all, one side then the other. A sensation of open air above and around, of complete exposure. And then the solidity of the far wall and the relief of having something solid behind you again. Felix pressed himself against the wall beside me. He was breathing hard, not from exertion. The crossing was 15 meters. From the crossing itself, from the compression of time and possibility that 15 meters of open ground under fire represented. He looked at me. His jaw had stopped grinding. His face had the flat, scrubbed quality that comes after the body processes something it was not designed to process repeatedly and simply runs out of the specific register of feeling that the situation calls for. Not numbness, something more precise than numbness. The expression of a man who has decided, in the absence of better options, to be exactly where he is and nothing else. I understood this expression. I had worn it myself. I wore it now. Brenner was already at the entrance of the building, waving us forward. We went. The Soviet position on the ground floor had been abandoned. There was evidence of occupation, a filed-down firing slot in the brickwork, shell casings, the smell of men who had been in an enclosed space for days, an unwashed cloth on the floor, and something else beneath the surface smell, a sweetness. In the particular sweetness that I had learned to recognize in this city, the sweetness that meant a body had been here for some time and was in the process of becoming something other than a body. I did not look for it. Felix did not look for it. Brenner moved through quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. We followed his example. We came through the building and out the back into a narrow yard between structures, and from there north again toward the workers' housing blocks that stood between our position and the factory perimeter. The buildings ahead were the ground we needed to cover. 3 blocks of residential structures, each one a prepared defensive position, each one connected to the next by passages knocked through the interior walls. This was how the Soviets defended in this city. Not the buildings. Oh, but the space inside the buildings, the walls themselves, the between spaces. You did not clear a room. You cleared a layer of the city, and then the next layer, and you bled for each one. I picked up the MG-34 and followed Brenner into the narrow yard. Felix was behind me. The factory was somewhere ahead, invisible behind the next line of destroyed residential blocks, present only as an objective on a map I had seen once and could no longer fully recall. It was there. We were here. The arithmetic between those 2 facts was the rest of the day. The first building stopped us before we reached it. Not Soviet fire, not a sniper. The building stopped us by itself through the simple fact of what it had become. A 4-story residential block that the bombardment had compressed into something that no longer had floors in any meaningful sense. The top 2 stories had pancaked into the bottom 2, and the bottom 2 had absorbed them and been altered by the absorption, and what remained was a structure that was technically still standing in the way that a man is technically still standing in the moment before he falls. Brenner looked at it for 30 seconds. Then he pointed left, toward the narrow gap between the building's western face and the ruins of the adjacent structure. We went around. This was the first lesson of Stalingrad that men from outside learned slowly and then could not unlearn. The direct route was rarely the route. The city had been designed for movement in one world and then destroyed into a different world entirely. And the new world had its own geography, its own logic of passable and impassable. You learned to read the new geography the way you learned any language, by immersion, by mistake, by the slow accumulation of patterns that eventually stopped requiring conscious thought. Brenner read it fluently. He had been reading it since September, which in this city made him a kind of elder, a repository of hard knowledge that had been purchased at prices no one had agreed to pay in advance. We came out into a rubble field on the building's northern side. The infantry section was already there, or what remained of it after the street crossing. 7 men where there had been 9. The section leader, a corporal named Hecht, whose age I had never determined but placed somewhere in the range of 40, older than most of us. Which in this army in this year meant he had survived things that would require a separate accounting, looked at Brenner and made a brief gesture toward the next building to the north. That building was still standing, not intact. Nothing here was intact, but structurally present in a way the first one was not. 2 stories, pre-war commercial construction, the kind that had been built to last when lasting meant something different than it meant now. The ground floor windows had been properly blocked, not with rubble, not with the improvised, hasty work of a position established under fire, but with deliberate construction, sandbags and brickwork alternating in a pattern, with small apertures at floor level. The Soviets had been here for weeks, long enough to learn, long enough to do the work correctly. Brenner studied the building for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he positioned us at a ground floor window on the south face and pointed up at the upper story. I understood. Set up, cover the approach, suppress anything that appears on the upper floor while the infantry goes in. Standard in theory, clean in description, considerably less clean in practice. I set the MG-34 into the window frame, found the bipod's purchase on the broken sill, settled the gun. The chamber was loaded. I could feel the weapon the way you feel a tool you have used long enough that it becomes continuous with your hands. Not the weight of it, not the mechanics of it, but the readiness, the potential energy of something that is about to function. Felix crouched to my left with the spare barrel case open. The infantry went in through the side wall. In an engineer, young, moving with the care of someone aware at every moment of what he was carrying, placed a charge against the east wall rather than the blocked entrance. The blast was sharp and flat and added a new layer to the ringing in my ears. The gap it made was low. You went through crouching. We heard the infantry almost immediately after they went in. Movement, boots on rubble, the sound of men moving through a space that had been prepared to kill them. Then a burst of submachine gun fire from inside that echoed badly in the enclosed space and told us nothing useful about who was shooting or at what. Then shouting in German. Then another burst, shorter. Then nothing for several seconds. Then a figure appeared at a window on the upper floor. Not a full figure, a partial shape, an arm and shoulder, sounded the posture of someone leaning out to assess what was happening in the street below. The posture of someone who did not yet know we were at the window across the street. I was already moving before I had made a conscious decision to move. The MG-34 came up. I found the shape in the sight picture. I pressed the trigger. What I fired was perhaps a 2-second burst, perhaps slightly longer. The figure in the window was gone before the burst ended. I did not look for where it had gone. Felix said something. I told him I knew. He already had the spare barrel ready in case I needed it, but the barrel was well within its limits, and I told him to put it back and watch the windows to the left of the one I had just engaged. The infantry came back out 17 minutes later. Brenner counted them as they emerged through the gap in the east wall. He did not share the count with the rest of us. His expression said what the count said. We had taken the building. We had paid what the building cost. These were related facts, and the relationship between them was the arithmetic of this city, and the arithmetic did not care whether you found it acceptable. We moved to the next building. This one was different in a way that announced itself before we reached it. Lower, 2 stories only, but with a quality of preparation that the previous building had lacked. The ground floor was sealed with the same deliberate brickwork, but more complete. No visible apertures at ground level. The windows on the upper floor had been partially blocked, leaving narrow horizontal slits, not firing positions for standing men, but for men lying prone, shooting through gaps no taller than a man's fist. While you could not see the men behind those slits, you could only know they were there and that they had arranged the mathematics of the position in their favor. Brenner spent 10 minutes looking at the building from various angles, moving low through the rubble field to the west, checking the sight lines, coming back each time with the same conclusion. We were going through the wall, the same engineer, the same careful movement. A different wall, the western face where a section of the ground floor had been partially weakened by the morning's bombardment, the brickwork cracked and bowed slightly outward. The charge went in. We pulled back. The blast brought down a section of wall 2 meters wide and perhaps 1.5 meters high. Low. You went through crouching, almost on your hands and knees. Brenner first, 2 infantry. Then me with the MG-34. The bipod catching on a piece of rebar protruding from the broken edge. A moment of resistance. Felix pushing from behind. The whole passage taking 3 or 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then Felix through. The ground floor was dark in a way that was different from the darkness of a room at night. A room at night has ambient light. This room had none. The windows were fully blocked. The only light came through the breach we had made, a low gray rectangle behind us, and through hairline gaps in the masonry that threw lines across the dust so thin they were almost theoretical. We moved by sound and by feel, the MG-34's barrel sweeping the space in front of me as I moved, a mechanical extension of attention into darkness I could not otherwise read. Contact came from above, under a hatch in the floor, in the ceiling of whatever was below us, which meant there was a basement, which we had not known. The hatch opened and a figure came up fast, already firing. The sound in that enclosed space was physically enormous, a pressure rather than a noise, something that occupied the chest cavity and pushed thought out of it entirely. Someone went down to my left. I swung the MG-34 in the direction of the muzzle flash and fired without a conscious decision to do so. A long burst, far longer than I should have used, the gun hammering against my hands, filling the room with a sound that left no space for anything else. When I released the trigger, My ears were producing a single continuous tone that was now the loudest thing in the world. Through it, dimly, I could hear Felix shouting my name. I could hear Brenner somewhere ahead. The hatch was still. The figure beside it was still. The air tasted of cordite and plaster and the burned metal smell of a barrel that had worked hard. The chamber hot enough that I could feel the heat radiating from it against my face when I tilted the gun to check the mechanism. We held the ground floor. We moved to the next building. It was in the third building that the day changed. We went in through another breach in the western wall. Brenner had standardized this approach after the first building, working from the assumption that the Soviets would expect entry from the south and prepare accordingly. The breach opened into what had been a ground floor commercial space, converted into a fighting position with the now familiar careful work. Blocked windows. Interior passages knocked through to the adjacent structure, firing apertures at floor level. But in this building, something was different from the moment we entered. The infantry section that had been moving with us, Hecht's men, had gone in 30 seconds before us through a different point of entry on the eastern face. That entry was supposed to draw attention, compress the Soviet defense inward, give us the western breach as a clean approach. It was a plan that worked on paper, the kind of plan that Brenner constructed with the competence of a man who understood how these things were supposed to unfold. What we found when we came through the breach was not what the plan had prepared us for. 6 German soldiers on the ground floor, all dead. He's not in the postures of men taken in an exchange of fire, not fallen in the act of advancing or covering or returning fire. In postures that told a different story. They had come through the eastern entry, moved into the ground floor, and found nothing. No resistance, no contact. They had moved forward into the interior of the building, and the building had been empty. And then from above, from positions we had not yet reached, from angles the empty ground floor had made them vulnerable to, the building had answered them. There were no Soviet dead on the ground floor. Not one. Brenner stood in the middle of the space and looked at the 6 men for a long moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling. Then he looked at me. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the 6 men on the floor had not already said more clearly. The Soviets had abandoned the ground floor before we arrived, had withdrawn upward, had allowed the infantry to enter, to feel the false relief of an uncontested entry, and had then engaged them from the floor above at angles that left no room for response. They had done this deliberately. They had done it because they had done it before, had refined it, had understood that the Germans would use the same approach, breach, entry, advance, and had arranged the geometry of the position to receive that approach with maximum effect. This was the thing that Brenner had been trying to explain to us, not in words, but through the accumulation of decisions. The way he checked every ceiling before he checked every floor, the way he never assumed that absence of contact on one level meant absence of threat on the next, the way he moved through buildings with the patience of a man who had already been shown what impatience cost. The cost was on the floor in front of us. Hecht was not among them. Hecht had not come through the eastern entry with his men. Hecht had held back. I learned this later from Brenner, who told me without inflection that Hecht's experience had expressed itself in the form of a decision to observe before committing, which was another way of saying that Hecht's experience had kept him alive one more time. 3 of his men had not had the benefit of that experience and had moved ahead. Brenner stepped over one of the fallen men without looking down. I followed. Felix followed. We went to the staircase. That was Stalingrad. You absorbed what the building delivered. You noted the cost. You continued. You did not stop to process what you had absorbed, because the processing would come later. In the dark, in the pauses, in the years afterward when the dark and the pauses had become permanent features of the interior landscape. In the moment, you continued. We went up. We cleared the second floor without contact. Empty. Abandoned. The firing position still warm. We went to the third floor and cleared it and found it empty too. Wherever the Soviets had been, they had gone through the walls into the adjacent structure, through the passages they had been building for weeks, moving laterally through the block in ways that required no staircase and left no predictable exit point. The building was ours. We did not know what it had cost. We would not know until Hecht counted what remained of his section and reported to Brenner in the flat. My factual way that Brenner required of reports, and Brenner received the number in the flat, factual way that he received everything, and the number became part of the day's accounting, another entry in the running total that nobody wrote down because writing it down would have required looking at it all at once. We moved to the next building. It was in that building, the fourth of the day, that we found the kitchen. We went in through another breach in the western wall. The breach opened into what had been a ground floor commercial space, converted into a fighting position. Past a fortified interior doorway, through a space that had been a corridor, was a room that the position's occupants had apparently decided was not worth fortifying because it was too far from any exterior wall to serve as a firing position. The room was a kitchen. I nearly missed it. I was moving through the interior doorway in a crouch, checking the sight lines in the next room, and my boot came down on something that gave under my weight differently than rubble or debris, a different resistance. I looked down. A child's shoe, small, dark leather, a style that had been current before the war. It was lying on its side next to the doorframe, separated from whatever had become of the foot it had belonged to. Present here in this destroyed building, in this destroyed street, in this destroyed city, as a single artifact of a life that had been lived in these rooms before these rooms became a tactical problem. I stepped over it, and then I saw the kitchen. The stove was still standing, a heavy tiled thing in the corner, the kind of construction that had been built to last through generations, and had, for through everything the bombardment had done to the building around it, remained structurally present, cracked on the left side, the tiles around the firebox shattered, but standing. The shelves above the preparation table had come down. But someone, not us, not during this assault, someone who had been here before, who had occupied this building as a position, who had slept in these rooms and eaten in this space, and maintained a fighting line from these windows. Someone had set the dishes that had fallen from those shelves back upright on the table. Not neatly, not in any particular order, but upright, stacked where they could be stacked, placed where placing them had been possible. And on the wall above the table, still adhered to the plaster by some mechanism of habit or care, was a photograph. Not a military photograph. A personal one, the kind that families had taken on occasions that mattered, at a studio, or outdoors in good light, by someone who understood that the moment was worth preserving. A man, a woman, two children, both young, both looking at the camera with the solemnity of children who have been told to hold still and are doing their best. The man was perhaps 30, dark hair, a jacket that had been put on for the occasion. He stood with his hand on the woman's shoulder, not a formal gesture, but a natural one, the gesture of a man who had been standing that way for years and did not think about it anymore. I looked at the photograph for 3 seconds, no longer. 3 seconds was the available time, but in those 3 seconds something happened that I did not have words for then and have struggled to find words for since. When the man in the photograph was not my enemy, he was not a soldier. He was a man who had put on his good jacket and stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder while someone took their picture. And then the picture had gone on the wall of their kitchen. And then the kitchen had become a strong point in a battle that neither the man nor his jacket had anything to do with. And someone who had occupied this strong point, one of the men we had been fighting through the floors above us, one of the men whose careful defensive work we had been dismantling all morning, had set the fallen dishes upright on the table, had chosen not to take the photograph down. I have thought about this for a long time. In the years since Stalingrad, I have thought about those dishes, about that careful arrangement, or about the fact that a man preparing a fortified position in a residential building had taken some number of minutes to do something that had no tactical purpose, no survival value, no function in the immediate calculus of the war. He had done it because the kitchen was someone's kitchen, because the photograph was someone's photograph, because even in that city, in that year, in the middle of all of it, some part of him had not been willing to be the thing that destroyed the kitchen. Felix had come up behind me. I felt him stop. I did not look at him. I did not need to. He had seen it. We cleared the ground floor and went up. The second floor was where the prepared positions were, firing apertures at floor level, the careful brickwork, evidence of sustained occupation. The positions were empty. abandoned recently. When the floor around them still held the residual warmth of bodies that had lain there. They had heard us coming. They had gone up. The staircase to the third floor was intact. We went up in the order Brenner established. 2 infantry first, then Brenner, then me with the MG-34, Felix behind. The staircase opened into a long room that had been 2 separate apartments before someone knocked through the dividing wall. The passage ran the full width of the building, a deliberate modification, creating a connected space that could be defended laterally, that gave the defenders room to move across the entire floor without entering the staircase. The Soviets were at the far end. I do not know how many. There is no counting in the moment. There is movement and muzzle flash, and the confusion of a space that is simultaneously too large to control and too small to escape. The 2 infantry went down almost immediately. Not killed, I learned later, but down. Brenner fired from behind a collapsed section of interior wall. I set the MG-34 on the nearest flat surface, the broken edge of that same collapsed wall, perhaps 60 centimeters high, and opened fire down the length of the room. This was not a short controlled burst. This was sustained fire in an enclosed space. The noise became a physical condition rather than a sound, something that occupied the body, that I felt in my teeth and in the bones behind my eyes and in the hollow of my chest. I fired and kept firing. The belt fed through. Felix was at my left shoulder, the next belt already in his hands, ready before the first was finished. The barrel was heating rapidly. I could feel it along the length of the weapon, the heat building and coming back toward me in a wave. I kept firing. At some point, Brenner put his hand on my shoulder and pushed down hard. I released the trigger. The room was full of smoke. Through the smoke, in the continuous tone in my ears, I could hear Brenner moving forward, checking. He came back and said, "We have the floor." Felix had already moved to the far end of the room. He was standing very still. I walked toward him through the smoke. My hands were shaking. The fine continuous tremor that was not fear, but the body's response to having operated at a level it was not designed to sustain for extended periods. Felix was looking at the floor. I came up beside him and looked. 4 men, all dead. 3 of them in the postures you expected. The specific arrangements that sustained automatic weapons fire at close range produced. Positions that had nothing to do with how men normally occupied space. The 4th was different. He was lying face down, arms at his sides, in a posture that had a different quality. Not the posture of a man who had been in motion when the firing started. The posture of a man who had been low, very low, deliberately small, not firing, not fighting, trying to be invisible in a room that offered no invisibility. He was young, younger than Felix, younger than 19, which was the average age of a Soviet soldier at Stalingrad. A number I had heard mentioned and had not fully processed until I was looking at this particular person on this particular floor. He was not carrying a weapon, so he was carrying a canvas bag with a red cross painted on it in rough strokes. A medic. The bag had come open when he fell, and its contents had scattered across the floor. Bandages, a folded cloth, small paper packets of sulfa powder, a pair of scissors with one blade bent. The tools of someone whose purpose in this room had been the opposite of mine. Felix said nothing for a long time. Neither did I. Then Felix said very quietly, "Not as a question?" He wasn't fighting. I did not answer. There was no answer available that would have been honest and also useful. The honest answer was, no, he was not fighting. He was doing the same thing that the German medics attached to our company were doing, moving through the combat space, trying to reach the men who needed reaching. I was trying to apply the contents of a canvas bag to problems that canvas bags were not designed to solve. He had been in the wrong room at the wrong moment, with the wrong trajectory of fire crossing the space he occupied. This was the arithmetic of the room. This was what the arithmetic produced when you ran it all the way to its conclusion. Brenner came up behind us. He looked at the floor. He looked at Felix. He said, "We need to be on the next floor. Now." Felix did not move immediately. This was the only time I saw Felix not move when Brenner gave direction. A second, perhaps 2, of stillness that was not defiance but something more private. A moment of accounting, of receiving what the room had delivered and beginning the process of carrying it. Then he moved. We went to the next floor. I will say this about Felix, and then I will not say more about it because it is his to carry and not mine to describe in detail. What Felix lost in that room had no name that I know of. It was not innocence. He had lost that before this building, probably before this city. It was not the ability to function. He functioned perfectly for the rest of that day and for all the days that followed, with the same efficiency and the same care and the same steadiness that had made him the best second man I had served with. What it was, I think, was a particular relationship to the question he had asked the night before. Whether the men across the street were waiting the same way we were, whether they were people in the way that we were people. The answer was yes. He had known the answer was yes when he asked it. But knowing something and having it placed in your hands as an object you cannot put down are different conditions. He carried it out of the building. He carried it into every building after that. He never asked a question like that again, which was not because he had stopped thinking about it. It was because he no longer needed to ask. The third building stopped us for 2 hours, a corner structure, which meant 2 faces exposed to open ground, which meant the Soviets inside had prepared accordingly. Firing positions on both faces, a clear sight line down the street we needed to use to reach the factory perimeter. We could not go around it. Brenner spent 10 minutes examining it from various angles and came back with the same conclusion each time. Through it or not at all. The sniper found us during those 10 minutes, and the first shot hit the wall above Felix's head, close enough that he felt the fragments against the back of his neck. He dropped without being told. The second shot came 6 seconds later, hitting the ground 2 meters to Brenner's left. Not suppressive fire, deliberate, aimed, patient. Someone in the upper floors of the corner building had identified our position and was working through it methodically. The way you work through a problem when you have time and training and a clear understanding of what the problem requires. The Soviet army understood snipers the way they understood artillery, as a resource to be deployed with strategic intention rather than tactical improvisation. They positioned their snipers the way you position furniture, with a clear sense of function and consequence. A sniper did not need to kill everyone. He needed to stop everyone. And stopping everyone meant that whatever was supposed to happen next did not happen, and whatever was supposed to happen after that did not happen. And the day shortened, and the ground taken in the morning had to be held through the night, and holding it cost men. And the next morning you started closer to where you had been than to where you needed to be. We lay in the rubble for a long time. The third shot came without warning and hit the infantry section leader somewhere behind us. I heard the impact. I will not describe the sounds that followed it. Brenner made a decision. He crawled back to where I was and said we were going left around the building's western flank, using the rubble field that the morning's bombardment had opened up. The rubble field was not good cover. It was better than nothing. Nothing was what we currently had. We moved in a low crawl. Brenner, then me with the MG-34 dragging awkwardly, one hand on the weapon and one hand pulling forward across broken ground that shifted and settled under my weight and made noise when it did. Every time it made noise, I stopped, waited. Nothing came. Felix moved behind me more quietly than I moved, with the economy of a man who had worked out through the morning's buildings exactly how much motion was necessary and exactly how much was not. The fourth shot came when we were halfway across, close enough that I believed I felt the displaced air of it. I pressed flat and waited, then I moved again, faster. We reached the western face of the corner building. Brenner had seen what he needed to see, a section of ground floor wall partially brought down by the bombardment, or a gap low enough to step over, opening into what had been a ground floor room. The Soviets had prepared the upper floors. This breach they had not addressed. Brenner went through first, which was the kind of thing he did that made it difficult to have straightforward feelings about him. Then 2 infantry, who had followed us across the rubble field without being ordered to, which was the kind of thing that happened in this city when men ran out of better options and recognized that the men in front of them were moving toward the same problem they were trying to solve. Then me through the breach, the MG-34 first, sweeping the space beyond with the barrel before committing my body to the opening. Then Felix. The room was a kitchen, the heavy tiled stove still standing in the corner. There were other things in the room, personal objects, the residue of a life that had been lived here before it became a tactical problem. I registered them and did not dwell on them. We had already been given one kitchen today. We did not need two. Brenner pointed up. The staircase was through the interior door, intact. We went up. The second floor was empty, abandoned, still warm from the bodies that had been there. They had heard us coming. They had gone up again, or gone through the walls again, or simply ceased to be a problem in the way that problems in this city sometimes resolve themselves before you reach them. We held the building. We moved to the next one. The factory perimeter appeared at the end of the afternoon. We reached it as the light was failing. Not the factory itself, the outer boundary of the complex, the surrounding wall of the barricade. And the barricade, one was seen from the outside at distance, had always been large in the abstract sense of a large thing you have been told is large. Now, standing at the edge of the approach, it was large in a different way, in the way that makes abstraction irrelevant. The wall where it stood was industrial masonry, 2 meters thick in places. Where the bombardment had breached it, the gaps were choked with debris. Twisted steel, collapsed roof sections, the enormous distorted remnants of machines that had been blown outward from the interior and come to rest at angles that seemed to resist the physics of their arrival. You did not walk through the perimeter of the barricade. You climbed through it, over it, under it, picking a route through a landscape that had no precedent in the residential blocks and commercial buildings of the workers' district. The scale was entirely different. The violence done to this place was entirely different. Not the violence of artillery aimed at buildings that people had lived in, but the violence of bombardment aimed at production, at capacity, at the industrial infrastructure of a country fighting for its existence. The machines inside had not been moved by any of it. This was the thing that hit me when Brenner found the gap in the wall. A section that had pancaked inward, creating a low tunnel of compacted rubble perhaps 4 meters long, and we went through on our stomachs and came out the other side into what had been a loading yard. The machines were still there. Lathes, presses, assemblies of steel I had no names for, bolted to the floor and unshifted by everything the bombardment had done to the building around them. Some were damaged. Barrels split, housings cracked, components scattered. But many were largely intact, standing in their positions with a quality I can only describe as indifference. They did not care about the battle. They had been here before the battle. They would be here after it, or the rubble of them would be here, which amounted to the same thing. They were obstacles. They were cover. And they were a source of profound disorientation, because the factory floor was a maze built for production and not for war, and the maze was not mapped, and the Soviets had been inside it for weeks. Felix stopped just inside the perimeter wall. I stopped beside him. We both looked at the interior of the main shed. The massive space of it, the open roof, watched the long gray columns of failing afternoon light coming down through the gaps in a way that made the air itself visible. The light moved the way light moves in water, slow, diffuse, touching the tops of the machines and leaving the spaces between them in shadow. Felix said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Someone built all of this." I did not answer because there was nothing useful to add. But I thought about it. Someone had designed these machines, had engineered them, manufactured the components, assembled them in this building, bolted them to this floor. Someone had run production schedules, had managed workers, had solved the 1,000 logistical problems of producing artillery pieces at industrial scale in a country that needed them desperately. And now the building that housed them was being contested room by room, machine by men who had been, most of them, something else entirely before the war made them what they were now. The scale of what human beings were capable of building, I thought, was matched precisely by the scale of what they were capable of destroying. This was not a new thought. It was not a thought that required Stalingrad to arrive at, but Stalingrad made it visible in a way that could not be looked away from. Brenner was already moving toward the main shed entrance. I picked up the MG-34. Felix picked up the ammunition. We followed. The light inside the main shed was failing fast. Brenner found the supervisory office on a raised steel platform above the factory floor, reached by a staircase of 12 steps that rang under our boots no matter how carefully we placed our feet. And the glass was long gone from the window frames, but the steel of the frames remained. From the platform, we had a clear view down the length of the central aisle, perhaps 80 meters to the far wall, where the overhead crane gantry had partially collapsed and come down at an angle, creating a barrier of sorts across the width of the space. The Soviets were somewhere beyond that gantry. I set the MG-34 on the window frame, angling the bipod to find purchase on the steel sill. Felix positioned himself to my left. Brenner stood at the back of the office watching the access points, the area beneath the platform, the interior doorway that connected the office to a space behind it that we had not cleared and could not clear without abandoning the window position. This was the kind of calculation that the city had been teaching us all day. The ongoing arithmetic of insufficient men and too many directions from which things could arrive. You made the best available choice and stood in it. The light failed. Not dramatically. It simply drained away over 30 minutes until the factory was dark in a way that had weight. The columns of light from the open roof narrowed to nothing. The shapes of the machines became suggestions, then outlines, then not even outlines. What remained was sound, and the factory at night was full of sound. I kept the MG-34 on the sill. I kept my eye on the aisle. I watched the darkness down the length of the central corridor, the shapes of the machines on either side of it, the motionless shadow of the gantry, the deeper darkness beyond. The aisle was empty, or the aisle appeared empty. In the factory at night, those were not the same thing. In the second part of the day was over. The third part was about to begin. The factory at night was a different country, not the city outside. The city outside had its own darkness, its own register of sound, its own vocabulary of threat that we had been learning since September. The factory was something else. The city outside had been a city once, had been designed for human occupation, had retained in its destroyed state some residual logic of streets and doorways and the movement of people between places. The barricade had been designed for machines, for production at industrial scale, for the logic of manufacturing, which is the logic of repetition and volume in controlled process. War had made it into neither one thing nor the other. It was not a city. It was not a factory. It was the space left over when both of those things had been destroyed simultaneously. And what filled that space was darkness and machinery and approximately 160 men on two sides of a collapsed crane gantry, all of them listening. I kept the MG-34 on the window frame of the supervisory office. The steel sill was very cold under my forearms. The weapon's metal was very cold under my hands. October cold in this part of Russia came through metal faster than through anything else, conducted it efficiently, drew it into whatever touched the surface, so that holding the gun for extended periods moved the cold from the steel into the bones of my hands and up through my wrists and forearms until the entire system was the same temperature as the factory floor. You did not think about this. You noted it and moved on. Below the platform, the factory floor extended in both directions, south toward the perimeter wall we had entered through, north toward the gantry and whatever was beyond it. The machines stood in their positions like monuments to a civilization that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Some of them were tall enough that their upper portions disappeared into the darkness above the factory floor, into the space where the roof had been and now was not, into the open October sky that was producing neither light nor heat. Felix had his back against the side wall of the office, knees drawn up, the ammunition case across his lap. He was doing the thing he had found, the controlled breathing, the managed stillness, in and out, measured, deliberate. The body's one fully controllable system, used as a lever against the systems that were not controllable. Brenner was at the back of the office, standing in the interior doorway that led to the space we had not cleared, not blocking it, monitoring it. The way you monitor a door you cannot lock and cannot abandon, by standing close enough to it that whatever comes through it finds you immediately, which is not a good position, but is better than the alternative. We had been here for 2 hours. Nothing had come through the door. Nothing had come down the aisle. The gantry had not moved. This was the factory's version of quiet, which was not quiet. It was the sustained, layered sound of a building under stress. Metal cooling at different rates from stone, the slow tick and groan of structural elements that had absorbed more than they were designed to absorb. Beneath that, In the city outside continuing its work. Artillery that never fully stopped. The general ongoing percussion of a battle that had no off switch, that ran continuously the way a factory runs continuously, shift after shift without pause. And beneath that, the sounds of the factory's other occupants. Footsteps, not constant, not regular. Periodic, at irregular intervals, coming from above, from whatever remained of the upper floors of the factory building, accessible by staircases we had not located and could not see. The steps were careful. The steps of someone who understood that sound in this space carried in ways that did not respect the geometry of walls and floors. Brenner heard them at the same time I did. He moved from the doorway to stand beside me at the window frame. We both looked up at the office ceiling, which was also the floor of whatever was above us, and listened. The sound stopped, then started again, further away. Or what seemed further away. Distance was unreliable in here. The factory's acoustics did things with sound that had no consistent logic. A noise that seemed to come from 10 meters away might be coming from 50. You listened and you accumulated information without attempting to organize it into certainty. Brenner returned to the doorway. I returned to the window. The gantry was a massive shadow at the far end of the aisle. 80 meters. In daylight, with the MG-34 in a clear sight line, 80 meters was a manageable distance. In this darkness, with no ambient light, with the machines on either side of the aisle creating pools of deeper shadow between them, 180 meters was theoretical. I was not watching 80 meters. I was watching the idea of 80 meters, trusting the geometry of the space rather than my ability to see through it. Felix passed me something in the dark. Hard bread, broken. I ate it without tasting it and kept my eye on the aisle. It was close to midnight when Brenner crouched beside me. He said very quietly that the company would push at first light. He said it without inflection. Information, not reassurance. First light was several hours away. Several hours in the factory was a long time. It was also not very long at all. I asked him about the 2 scouts, the men sent north along the eastern wall of the shed hours ago. Brenner was quiet for a moment. Then he said they had not come back. He said this the way he said things that he had already processed and filed in the functional part of himself, flatly without the weight of what the fact implied, because the weight of what it implied was not something that could be usefully carried during a night watch in a factory where the Soviets were 40 meters away, or 80 or 20, and you genuinely could not tell which. I looked at the darkness beyond the gantry. The scouts had not come back. This meant several things, and not one of them was good. If the scouts had been taken alive, the Soviets now knew our position, our number, our direction of planned advance. The attack at first light would not be a surprise. It had possibly never been a surprise. In this city, in this factory, with 100 meters between the 2 sides, the surprise was a concept that required more space than was available. But now it was definitively not a surprise. Brenner had already accounted for this. I could tell from the fact that he did not ask me what I thought about it, because what I thought about it was irrelevant to what we would do, which was hold the position through the night and advance at first light regardless. I stopped thinking about the scouts. The aisle required watching. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, Brenner found Misha. He had been conducting his periodic check of the area beneath the platform, moving down the steel staircase in increments small enough not to produce sound, checking the shadows under the platform structure, the spaces between the support columns, the ground level area that our position above could not cover. He did this every 40 minutes, with the regularity of a man who understood that the threat you checked for was less dangerous than the threat you stopped checking for. On this check, he did not come back immediately. Felix noticed before I did a change in the quality of the silence below. Felix straightened slightly from his position against the wall. I kept the MG-34 on the sill but shifted my attention. Then Brenner appeared at the top of the staircase. He did not speak. He made a brief downward gesture with his hand. Not urgent, not alarmed, but the gesture of a man who has found something and has not yet determined what to do about it and requires the people he trusts to come and be present in the situation. Felix went first. I angled the MG-34 to cover the aisle from a standing position and followed. Beneath the platform, in the space between the second and third support columns, A man was lying on his back. He was wearing a Soviet uniform. What had been a Soviet uniform, it was difficult to identify it as such now, torn and dark with dried blood along the left side, from somewhere below the ribs down to the hip. He had been lying here for some time, hours at minimum. He had not made a sound during any of those hours, which meant either that he had been unconscious for most of them, or that he had been conscious and had made the calculation that making a sound would produce an outcome worse than not making one. He was conscious now. He was looking at us, not with the intensity of a man assessing a threat. His eyes did not move to the MG-34, did not track the geometry of the space, did not do any of the things the eyes of a man planning action do. He looked at us with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place past planning, past options, past the particular kind of attention that survival requires. He was looking at us the way you look at something when looking is the only thing left available to you. On the small chain around his neck, pressed against the skin of his throat, was a metal tag. I leaned close enough to read it. Misha. He was perhaps 25. Dark hair, several days of beard, a face that might have been unremarkable in any other context, but here, in the dark, under the platform of the supervisory office of the Barikati factory, had the quality of a face you would remember. Not because of any particular feature, because of the quality of a man looking at you from a place past options. Nobody said anything for a moment. Oh, this was not tactical hesitation. We all understood simultaneously that the tactical situation had a clear logic, and that the clear logic was not the only logic present in the moment. Misha was a Soviet soldier. He was wounded, unarmed, incapacitated. The tactical logic was not ambiguous, but the tactical logic was not the only thing in the room. Brenner stood very still. This was how Brenner registered things that required his full attention. By becoming completely still, every resource withdrawn from movement and directed at thought. He stood that way for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the staircase and began climbing. And at the top of the staircase, he paused and said, without turning around, that the interior doorway needed checking. He went to check the interior doorway. Felix looked at me. I looked at Misha. Misha looked at the ceiling. Felix reached into his coat and produced the canteen. He crouched and held it near Misha's face. Misha's eyes moved to it. Felix tilted it carefully, one hand supporting the back of his head, and Misha drank. Not urgently, not greedily, but steadily, the way a man drinks when he is not sure how much time he has and wants to use the time well. When he finished, Felix took the canteen back and stood up. He did not say anything. Misha did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have functioned in this space. Not across the language, not across the situation, not across the 40 meters, and all the arithmetic that 40 meters had contained since the previous night. But the question Felix had asked in the darkness of the first night, do you think the men across the street are waiting the same way we are? Had an answer now that did not require language. Yes. The answer was yes. He had known the answer was yes when he asked the question. But knowing something and having it placed in your hands as a physical, present, breathing fact are different conditions. Misha was 25 years old. He had a name on a chain around his neck. He had drunk the water that Felix offered him. He was the answer. We went back up the staircase. I will not say what happened to Misha after that. I will say only that when the light came and we were able to see the area beneath the platform clearly, he was not there. Either someone had come for him in the dark, through some passage or gap we had not located, or through some route that the defenders of the northern half of the shed knew and used, or he had moved himself, through what effort I cannot imagine given the condition he was in. What I know is that Brenner never mentioned him, Felix never mentioned him, and the water in Felix's canteen, the next time I noticed it, had been refilled from somewhere I did not ask about. Some things in war resolve themselves in ways that do not require an accounting. Misha was one of them. I prefer it that way. It was just past 4 in the morning when the Feldwebel came up the staircase. His boots on the steel rang in the cold air. He had been making his rounds of the company positions all night, and each time he had come up, he had spoken to Brenner briefly and descended again. Each time Brenner had said nothing useful afterward. This time was different. He and Brenner spoke for longer. I kept my eye on the aisle. I could hear the tone of it, not the words, but the register, the quality of two men exchanging information that changes the shape of the situation rather than information that confirms the existing shape. When the Feldwebel descended, Brenner stood still for a long moment. Then he came to the window and crouched beside me. He said, "The attack is canceled." He said it without inflection, the same way he said everything. But there was a quality to the stillness that followed the words, a quality I had not encountered in Brenner before, that told me this was different from the other things he had said without inflection. I asked him why. He said, "Operation Uranus." The name meant nothing to me at that moment. It was a name from the strategic level of the war, from the level of maps and arrows and objectives measured in hundreds of kilometers, rather than in floors and window gaps. I did not operate at that level. I operated at the level of the aisle, the gantry, the 12 centimeters. But Brenner explained it in the way he explained things. Briefly, without interpretation, as a series of facts that he allowed to carry their own weight without commentary. The Soviets had launched a massive offensive to the north and south of Stalingrad. Two converging attacks moving fast aimed at the flanks of the German position rather than at the city itself. The flanks had been held by Romanian forces. The Romanian forces had broken. The two Soviet spearheads were moving toward each other across the frozen steppe west of the city. They had nearly met. When they met, one of the 6th Army, or 300,000 men, would be encircled. Completely. The city that had been the objective, the factory that we had fought through an entire day to partially enter, the ground we had measured in floors and bodies, and the arithmetic of insufficient men. All of it would be inside a Soviet encirclement. All of us would be inside it. I looked at the gantry. The gantry was the same, 80 meters away, a mass of collapsed steel crossing the width of the aisle. The darkness beyond it was the same darkness it had been all night. Nothing had changed in the physical space of the factory. The machinery stood in its positions. The cold conducted itself through the metal of the sill into my forearms. But the shape of everything had changed. We had been an army advancing into a city. Now we were an army standing inside a closing fist. I thought about the 400 meters between our original position and the factory perimeter, the 11 days and 2,000 casualties that the arithmetic had predicted. The way Brenner had delivered the news of the attack the previous night, as a statement of what would happen, spoken by a man who had already accounted for the ways it could go wrong. I thought about whether Brenner had known then what he knew now. Not the specifics, not the name, not the operational details, but the general direction of things. I thought he probably had. He was from Demyansk. He had been inside an encirclement before. He knew what the closing of a ring felt like from the inside. Not as a strategic abstraction, but as a physical condition, and as a change in the quality of the space you occupied when the space became finite, when the edges of it became walls, when movement in every direction eventually arrived at the same conclusion. He had survived it once. He said nothing about whether he thought we would survive it again. He went to check the staircase below. Felix had heard. He was sitting exactly where he had been, back against the side wall, knees up, the ammunition case in his lap. But the quality of his stillness had changed. He was looking at the window. He was very still in the way that people are very still when they are holding something large and trying to determine the shape of it before deciding where to set it down. I came and sat beside him. After a time, Felix said, 300,000 men. He was not asking me anything. When he was saying the number out loud to hear what it sounded like as a spoken thing rather than as a thought. 300,000. The number of men who would wake up inside a Soviet encirclement when the ring closed. The number of men for whom the shape of everything had just changed. We were two of them. He said, "Do you think they know yet? The men in the other positions?" I told him that Brenner would tell them what they needed to know when they needed to know it. This was not an answer to his question, and Felix knew it was not an answer to his question, but he accepted it as the available response and said nothing more. The cold deepened. The factory contracted around us in the way that large structures contract at night. Metal cooling at different rates, the slow tick and stress of materials under thermal change. Yes, the artillery outside continued its work. The percussion of it came through the factory floor as a continuous low trembling. I kept the MG-34 on the window frame. I kept watching the aisle. The gantry moved at 3:30. Not the whole structure. A section of it, the collapsed crane arm that lay across the aisle, its southern end resting on the factory floor, perhaps 40 meters from the office platform. That end shifted, moved perhaps half a meter along the floor, producing a grinding of steel against concrete that was loud enough to hear clearly through everything, through the ringing in my ears, through the city's artillery, through the factory's own sounds. Something had pushed it, something on the other side. Brenner's hand came down on my shoulder immediately. Hard, steady, hold. I held. The silence after the gantry moved was different from the silence before it. Before it had been the silence of two sides in proximity, each aware of the other, each waiting for the other to define the next moment. After it was the silence of two sides that had just exchanged information, the push and the absence of response to the push, and were processing what the exchange had established. What it had established, we were here, we knew they were there. We were not going to fire into the darkness at the sound of a gantry moving, which meant we were either very disciplined or very few. We were both. I had the MG-34 aimed at the southern end of the gantry, at the gap between the crane arm's end and the eastern wall of the shed, a gap of perhaps a meter that was the most likely approach route if someone came through the gantry line. At 40 meters in total darkness, I would be firing at shape and sound rather than at anything clearly visible. I was prepared to do this. The gun was ready. I was ready. Nothing came through the gap. The gantry did not move again. The factory settled back into its nighttime register. I had been awake for more than 20 hours. The fatigue was not the fatigue of tiredness. It was structural, present in the load-bearing elements, in the parts that held everything else up. My arms ached from the sustained maintenance of position. My back ached from the hours against the window frame. The cold had moved from the surfaces of things into the interior of things, into the marrow of the question of whether any of this had a resolution that was worth the cost of reaching it. I did not pursue this question. The aisle required watching. Sometime after 4, Felix said, "Do you remember what your house smelled like?" I thought about this. I could recite the facts about my house, the street it was on, the shape of the kitchen table, rectangular, dark wood, 4 chairs, one of which had a loose leg that my father had repaired 3 times and eventually simply accepted as a permanent feature of the chair. The sound my father made when he laughed, which was his laugh, the one that belonged to him and to no one else. The facts were there. But Felix had not asked about the facts. He had asked about the smell, the specific sensory reality of a particular place that had nothing to do with tactical information, nothing to do with the useful categories of knowledge that survival required. I tried. I found something. Faint, imprecise, with the suggestion of a smell rather than the smell itself. Bread and the specific quality of air in a room where the windows were small and the light came in from the east, and the morning in summer had a warmth and clarity that the morning in no other place I had been had quite replicated. I held on to it for a moment, then it was gone. What I could not recover was not the fact of the house. It was the feeling of being inside the facts, the physical reality of a world that was not made of steel and concrete, and the weight of a weapon that had been on my shoulder for most of the day. The feeling, the specific bodily feeling, of being in a place that was not this place and had not been designed to kill you. I told Felix, "I remember the morning light." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's enough. That's something." He said it the way you say something when you have decided to accept less than you wanted, because accepting less is the honest response to what is available, not resignation, something more deliberate than resignation. The choice to find the thing that was there rather than continuing to look for the thing that was not. This was, I thought, the best thing I had seen anyone do in this city. Find the thing that was there. The morning light in a house on a street in Bavaria. Faint, imprecise. The suggestion of it rather than the reality. But present, still present, underneath everything the city had laid on top of it. Still findable if you were willing to stop requiring it to be more than it was. I kept my eye on the aisle. The gantry was motionless. The darkness beyond it was the same darkness it had been all night. The light came the way it always comes, not dramatically, not as a sunrise, not as a clear moment of transition from dark to not dark. It drained in the way darkness drains from large spaces, slowly from the top down, from the open roof first, the sky above the factory beginning its long process of differentiation from black to charcoal to gray. Each increment so small as to be imperceptible in itself, but accumulating over the course of an hour into something that could be seen. I had been watching for it without knowing I was watching for it. When I first noticed it, I did not trust it. I had been in enough long nights to know that the first suggestion of light was not yet light, that the eye, desperate for relief, finds things in the darkness and calls them light when they are not yet light. But eventually the light was real. The shapes of the machines resolved from suggestions back into shapes. The aisle became an aisle again, a physical space with defined edges, with the geometry of its obstacles and clearances, rather than the theoretical space I had been guarding by mathematics and listening. The gantry became visible as a structure. The gap between its southern end and the eastern wall became a gap I could actually see. Nothing was in the gap. The aisle was empty. Brenner descended to the floor below to join the company. The sounds from below changed as the light came. The low voices of men who had held a position through a night and were beginning the process of preparing for what came after. Not energy exactly, not alertness. In the particular mobilization of men who have no energy left, but understand that the absence of energy is not a reason to remain still. Felix had come fully awake at the first light, the immediate transition of a man who had not been truly asleep, only waiting with his eyes closed. He straightened against the wall. He looked at the window. He looked at me. I had not moved from the window. He came and crouched beside me and looked down the aisle with me, both of us looking at the gantry and the empty gap and the gradually brightening space beyond it, where the Soviet positions were and where the push would eventually go, today or tomorrow or whenever the orders came, encirclement or not. After a moment, he said, "You didn't sleep. I told him one of us needed to watch the aisle." When he looked at me with the expression of a man who knew this was true and also knew it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had not been able to stop watching, that the watching had become the thing, the fixed point, the only activity available that had clear purpose and clear direction, and did not require me to think about encirclements or kitchens or the weight of things that had been placed in your hands and could not be set down. He put his back against the side of the window frame, facing the aisle, and took his position beside me. Ready, the spare barrel in its case, the ammunition arranged. This was Felix, still doing the work, still finding the thing that was there, rather than requiring the thing that was not. I looked at the MG-34. In the growing light, I could see it clearly for the first time in hours. The barrel, either the receiver, the drum housing, the bipod legs on the steel sill. 12 kilograms of weapon that had been in my hands or on my shoulder for most of the past 24 hours, that had done the work that such weapons do, that had been present for everything the day had contained. I looked at it the way you look at something when you are outside of it rather than inside it, when you are not using it and not about to use it, and there is a moment, small, impermanent, in which you can see the thing itself rather than the function of the thing. It was a gun. It had been other things during the day, a fixed point, a purpose, a reason to stay in position when position was the only available answer to impossible questions. It had been the thing I held when everything else receded. It had been, and in some sense I do not yet fully have words for, the thing that kept me from becoming nothing in a city that was trying to reduce everything to nothing. But at this moment, in this light, it was a gun. And the question that did not state itself as a question, that simply existed as a weight, was what I would be when I was not holding it, who I would find when I set it down, whether the person on the other side of the gun was still there, still present, still someone who could remember the morning light in a house on a street that was not this street. I did not know the answer. I was 24 years old. I had been in this city for 6 weeks. I had done the work the city required, and I would continue to do it for as long as it required doing. Because the orders had not changed and would not change until something changed them from above. and nothing above my level was moving in a direction that suggested they would be changed soon. But I had looked at the photograph in the kitchen. I had watched Felix offer water in the dark. I had spent a night in a factory full of machines that someone had built and someone else had tried to destroy, and that remained indifferent in their positions on the floor, bolted there by the intention of people who had not foreseen this particular morning. These things had happened. They were part of what had happened. They would be part of whatever I carried out of this building, out of this city, if carrying out was what was going to happen. The men who came back from the Hurtgen forest, from the frozen ridgelines of Korea, from the long nights of Vietnam, they understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that the weight you carried out was never just the weight of the weapon, it was the weight of what the weapon had been present for. The kitchen and the photograph, the man named Misha, the medic on the floor, Conrad in the doorway, Felix asking questions in the dark that did not go away. That weight does not decrease with time. It becomes familiar. That is not the same thing. Below, the company was assembling. Brenner's voice came up from the factory floor, clipped, functional. The sounds of men organizing themselves for what came next. 30 men. 28. The number that remained after the arithmetic of the day had been calculated. Brenner appeared at the top of the staircase. He looked at me. He looked at Felix. And he looked at the aisle. The empty aisle. The motionless gantry. The growing light that was making the factory's geometry visible again, re-establishing the distances and the sight lines and the specific geography of the position we had held through the night. He said, "The company is ready." I picked up the MG-34. The cold of the metal moved into my hands. The familiar weight settled against my shoulder. The bipod folded up. The drum housing engaged. 12 kilograms. The tool I knew. The fixed point. The thing with weight and purpose and a function that the morning required. Felix rose beside me, the ammunition in its case, the spare barrel ready. I looked down the aisle one more time. The gantry was motionless. The gap between its southern end and the eastern wall was empty. The darkness beyond it had thinned enough that I could see shapes, the dark masses of machines on the far side, the suggestion of walls and spaces, and the continued presence of the people we had been sharing this building with all night. They were still there. We were still here. This was the situation. Outside the factory, the encirclement was closing. The ring was drawing tight around 300,000 men and everything they had brought with them. Their weapons and their supplies and their orders and the intentions of the commanders who had sent them here, and the country that stood behind those commanders and the ideology that stood behind that country, and all of it, all the vast grinding machinery of what we had been inside, contracting toward a center that was this city, this factory, this aisle. Inside the factory, a man with a gun was watching a gap. These were both true. They had both been true all night. They would both be true for as long as the morning lasted. I followed Brenner down the staircase. The boots rang on the steel. The light was coming up fast now, filling the shed from the open roof, touching the tops of the machines. Moving down the aisle in the slow, water-like way that light moved in this space. Felix was behind me. I did not look back to confirm it. I could feel him there. The presence of the man you have worked alongside long enough that his position in space becomes continuous with your awareness of your own. He was there. We reached the factory floor. Of the 300,000 men encircled at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 returned home after the war. What happened inside the pocket between November 1942 and February 1943 is a story that belongs to them, not to me. I can only tell you what I know from the morning of October 1942, from one supervisory office above one factory floor, from the particular vantage of one man who had spent a night watching an aisle and was now being asked to walk down it. We were still here when the light came. For some of us, that was enough. For most of us, it would have to be. The light came. I picked up the gun. We were still here.